Whilst I've gone on record in videos before about how I only rarely watch anime or read manga, that wasn't always the case. Growing up, I only ever had Italian television, and so a large part of my childhood was anime and manga. Dragon Ball, Fist of the North Star, and Lupin the Third to name a few. But amongst those, one of my favorites has always been Rumiko Takahashi's Ranma. A story about the titular son of a martial artist who falls into one of the many cursed springs of Juzenkyo in China. Since then, his body is cursed to turn into that of a girl whenever he's splashed with cold water, but turns back into that of a man with hot water. After being literally dragged back to Japan, he's then forcefully engaged to Akane, the daughter of one of his father's friends. As the series goes on, they also introduce a bunch of other characters with similar curses, like Ranma's father, whose curse turns him into a panda, while also creatively reimagining completely unrelated things like ice skating or mining into fighting styles. It's a mix of both rom-com and martial arts, with incredibly creative stories and fights, a cast of incredibly charming characters, and wonderfully nuanced writing. Recently, a new anime adaptation has started airing on Netflix, and so I felt it was a good time to bust out my old volumes and give it a reread. It still holds up wonderfully and remains as one of my favorites in the medium. There's also the old 80s anime adaptation, but I never much liked it due to how much it changes, all for the worse mind you. While other series like Dragon Ball or Fist of the North Star perfectly suit themselves to specific genres like beat-em-ups and fighting games respectively, Ranma's unique blend would allow it to fit in a much wider range of genres. Considering I was already in the right mind space, I thought it'd be fun to see what kind of games there were. And honestly, the selection is just bizarre. Mind you, 3 of them are just pachinko games, so we can safely ignore those, but the rest are definitely something. With that said, let's get into it. Kakuren Bodesu Match is the first game the series ever got, and I'm already confused, so we're off to a great start. This is a Game Boy block-pushing puzzle game, which puts it into the same prestigious category as Adventures of Lolo and Quirk, and if any of those words meant something to you, I fear it's already too late. There's not really a story as far as I can tell, and the game takes place over a series of 5 levels that are all based on some location from the show, with characters relevant to that respective location chasing you around like ghosts from Pac-Man. If they touch you, Ranma falls into the ground and starts crying, so you clearly don't want that. The objective is the same in every stage, collecting a hat, a glove, and a ribbon to spawn in Akane. Run into her and you win. To get the items you have to push around rocks or whatever other material is currently pushable in the level. Pushing an object that's already at a wall or a different object breaks it. There's other breakable stuff around that can contain either a bucket or a kettle that turn you into female and male respectively. For the sake of my sanity, I'll be referring to the male form as Ranma and the female form as Ranko for the rest of the video. The major difference between the two forms is that while Ranma pushes blocks all the way to the next wall, Ranko just pushes them by one tile. Putting 2 or more non-breakable blocks next to each other makes them all disappear. Other than to clear, you can also use this to kill or trap enemies, temporarily taking them out of the level. Out of all of the games here, this is probably the one that has to do with the source material the least, but it's kind of a solid standalone puzzle game. And now we're getting into the really interesting stuff. At its core, Ranma for the PC Engine is a 2D beat-em-up, and a pretty basic one at that. Because the PC controller only has 2 buttons, all you get is a jump and an attack. Though you can double jump, and if you do, you can give yourself a weird rainbow battle aura by holding down and attack simultaneously. It's a giant pain in the ass to use, but actually deals a shit ton of damage and melts bosses. On its own, this would be totally fine. There's plenty of other beat-em-ups like it on the PC, Splatterhouse being probably the most similar example. The issue is genuinely everything else. On-the-ground movement feels sluggish, and in the air it's way too floaty. Once you jump, you're dedicated to the arc like in Castlevania, though you can kind of sort of influence it with the double jump. That is assuming you can even get it out to begin with, because this game is ridiculously unresponsive. It often feels like you have to spam it to be able to use the double jump. This is especially bad on the first level, because it's got platforming. It's the only one that does for some reason. The only consistent way to get through the stage is to just mash attack in the air to stall your airtime and hopefully make it over. It's also extremely annoying when trying to fight enemies, because you have to position yourself just right or your attacks won't connect at all. It's extremely frustrating how inconsistent the hitboxes are in this game, leading to a lot of situations where you, for all intents and purposes, should be hitting your opponent but just take damage instead. And because jumping is your only real offensive maneuver, a lot of the fights just devolve into hoping for the best as you mash buttons. Some bosses also have stuff like projectiles that are just complete bullshit to deal with. This also applies to the versus mode that this game has for some reason. Player 2 can play as the bosses, but their moves are taken away and they play identically to Ranma. The actual levels themselves really don't fare much better. The moment you load in, you're instantly bombarded by a million things trying to kill you all at once. So keeping full health until a boss is rarely if ever going to happen. Sometimes you can find some pickups, but the only one that really matters is these Genma tokens that let you summon him as both an on-screen nuke and a instant transformation. You can also transform for free at any water source in the game. And here we have the start of a recurring theme in these games wherein Ranko is faster but weaker than Ranma. Story-wise, the game adapts the earlier parts of the manga, with the last level being wholly original. And every level is introduced and capped capped off with an animated cutscene. These honestly tend to look really uncanny a lot of the time, with the characters being pretty off-model a lot. But to their credit, each level has 2 ending cutscene variations depending on what form you beat the boss as. This, surprisingly enough, is also something that's gonna come up throughout multiple of these games. But there is one thing that this game does really well. The music is way better than it has any right to be, being one of the first games ever composed for by Koji Hayama, who would later go on to compose for games like Front Mission 3 and Mega Man ZX Advent. And it shows, especially in Ryoga's boss theme, that just has a really good guitar riff partway through for absolutely no reason. Toraware no Hanayome is the second game released on PC, and instead of the fighting part of the series, focuses on the comedy and slice of life aspect. This is a visual novel fully voiced by the cast of the anime, who actually also voiced pretty much every other game in this video. And I'd say it has adventure game elements, but that'd just be a lie, since it's entirely menu based, and you just exhaust every option until you proceed, no thought required. Instead of adapting anything from the show or manga, the game instead tells an original story in 3 chapters, the first of which revolving around the high school's principal hosting a contest wherein the winners get to go to China, which is similar to an arc in the manga, and so Ranma immediately decides to participate in the hopes of being able to cure his curse. The story is fun enough, but it can seriously drag out, despite not being that long, often feeling like one of the way too many filler episodes of the anime. It's also never been translated, so unless you're a super hardcore fan, you're really not missing out on anything by not playing this game. Hiryu Densetsu disappointed me hard. Point-and-click adventure games are right up my alley, and having one based on something like Ranma sounds like it would be a great time, but unfortunately this game just sucks. For one, there's no real consecutive narrative, instead consisting more so of a bunch of side stories, with the main appeal being the character interactions. Unfortunately, a lot of the writing lacks the humor and charm that makes the original stand out, so it drags on hard. A lot of the time it's also just unclear where you need to go or who you need to talk to, so it quickly devolves into going through every area and talking to everyone a million times. Now, sometimes when talking to certain characters, you'll initiate a combat sequence, and here we see the start of a trend going forward that I genuinely do not understand. For some reason, several of these games utilize a rock paper scissors style combat system, in this game being punches, kicks, and sweeps. It's exactly as annoying as it sounds, and I didn't even bother finishing this game. It's just a chore to go through. The only real positive I have about it is that the sprite work is solid. Now, one thing worth noting is that the game does actually have a bit of notoriety. Not because of anything in the game itself, mind you, but because the anti-piracy screen has Ranko flashing his tits at you. You know, maybe this video was actually a bad idea. Chōnai Gekitōhen is the first proper fighting game that the series would get. Sure, the PC Engine game had a versus mode, but that was hardly the focus there. Coming out barely a year after Street Fighter 2, this is one of the many games of the era that tried to capitalize on this relatively new style of game. And so, it has a lot of very unique quirks. Basics first. You get a punch, a kick, a jump, and a special button that shoots up projectiles for most of the characters, though not all of them, as well as a block. Pressing both attack buttons simultaneously gives you access to a second special. With a control scheme this simple, you'd assume they couldn't possibly fuck it up, but despite that, this game is terrible to play. Everyone controls like they have 18 sticks up their ass at all times, and sometimes inputs just won't come out at all. Normals are also completely inconsistent in how well they'll work, to the point where characters like Genma or Ryoga, who can just spam projectiles, have a clear advantage over every other character that isn't Ranma, because both of his forms get a double jump. Visually, something about the game also just strikes me as odd. Barring the 2 stages in the Nintendo household, everything just feels out of place for the series. The character select is also unlike any I've ever seen. It's just a black void with a single character's portrait on top that you have to shuffle through to select someone. Now there is an extended select menu, but to access it you have to hold the shoulder buttons down before selecting a mode. If there is one good thing I can say about this game, it's that it's the only game where Cologne has ever been playable. However, in exchange, Akane of all characters is totally absent. Usually this is where I'd move on, but there is one big thing about this game that I neglected to mention until now. See, this is actually one of the only 2 games to ever be officially translated. Europe never got it, but America? Well, they got Street Combat. Mechanically, the game is identical. All the characters and moves are the same, but everything else is completely different. I guess they didn't think a guy who turns into a chick would be as marketable as Steve in armor and Steve in clothes. Netsuretsu Kakutouhen is the second game on the Game Boy, and the one that's closest to one of the console games. The story is once again original. This time every character who was cursed in Jusenkyo gets a letter sent to them by the guide inviting them to join a competition with each other, with a grand prize for the winner. And of course they all join in the hopes of being able to be cured. This is more of an adventure game than anything else. The closest game I can think of that's somewhat similar to it is Zelda 2, oddly enough. For most of the game you just walk around the really empty town with its sections separated by a world map, occasionally entering buildings here and there to meet with one character so that that you can trigger something with a different character elsewhere so you can actually progress. Occasionally you will run into enemies, and the combat is actually surprisingly similar to that of the PC Engine game. The main difference is that instead of the weird double jump battle aura thingy, you have the ability to block. The hitboxes are still really infuriating, but Ranma feels much weightier, and that and the block help make the fights feel leagues better. You can also jump into the pond at the Tendo estate to transform. Unlike most of the other games, Ranko is weaker, but faster. And since you spend more time out of battle than in, it helps make traversal much better. It also changes some dialogue with characters, like completely letting you skip the first fight. Unfortunately, they had to ruin it one way or another. The big one is that the game can be really aimless. Sometimes what you need to do is as simple as talking to one character who tells you to talk to a different one, but other times you'll just be blindly guessing your way through, going wherever you can and hoping to stumble upon the path forward. There's also the Kuno Mansion. There's only 5 chapters in the game and all of them are pretty short, but 2 of them are dominated by this one location. It's basically just a giant maze with the vanishing blocks from Mega Man. The issue is that because of the weird jumping arc you have in this game, making those jumps is extremely infuriating, and if you fail once you could potentially be sent back all the way to the start. The best way I found to deal with it is to jump and then only start moving as you're about to land again. It's extremely frustrating. But other than that, this game is actually quite alright, with a lot for fans to appreciate. Datou Ganso Musabetsu Kakutou-ryuu is the last of the PC Engine games, and it's also far and away the worst. Narratively, this one's all over the place, adapting different arcs from all over the series totally out of order, so I'm not even gonna try to make sense of it. I guess this is kind of a fighting game? It doesn't really feel right to call it that though, since it's barely got any fighting game mechanics. It's more like a boss rush game than anything. Each level puts you into a different fight from the series, with some of them actually having pretty unique gimmicks, like the fight against Kodachi completely changing your moveset, or the one against Ukyo having a grill plate at the edges of the arena that hurts you if you step on it. Unfortunately, actually playing this game is miserable. In an inverse of the first PCE game, Ranma feels horrendously stiff to control. Once again, you just have an attack and a jump button. Almost every action is dictated by what direction you're holding the button in when you press it. So for instance, pressing down an attack results in a sweep, while back and jump makes you do a backflip that has iframes. Holding down the attack button also lets you charge up a special attack you can use, though hitting with it is a giant pain in the ass because of how small its reach is. This is the only game where you can swap between Ranma and Ranko freely by pressing a button, giving you the usual trade-off of speed for damage. Depending on what form you beat the stage in, the cutscenes also change. After you get the bosses to half health, which is really hard to tell because, I mean, just look at this health bar, I can't tell what's going on here, they start using their desperation moves that force you to deal with some sort of gimmick, like Hapusai hiding inside of a barrel that you have to beat him out of. That's pretty much it for the main game, though between levels you can sometimes gamble by playing Old Maid, which gets you extra lives. There's also a post-game bonus mode entirely based around playing Old Maid. There's also a versus mode where you can play as any of the bosses, though obviously without any of their special moves. Hard Battle is the only Ranma game to ever have been released outside of Japan besides Street Combat, coming out in both America and Europe. Most of the footage you're going to be seeing here is from the American version, as the game remained almost entirely unchanged. We'll get to that. The European version uses the French names for the characters, which are fucking bizarre. Any French people watching this, please send me a handwritten apology and explanation as to why the fuck they felt the need to change Ukyo to Frederick. The only difference in the US version is that they replaced the entire voice cast. I don't know if these are the English dub's voice actors or whatever, but it's not good and it caught me really off guard. Ranma sounds like he's in his 30s, and for some reason everything that's not a win code is still in Japanese. This game starts a weird trend of the roster having oddball one-off characters playable instead of more relevant recurring ones. You've obviously got all the usual core cast members, but then they also included Gosum Kugi, a very minor character who doesn't know how to fight, and the Gambling King, who was a one-off villain. And as the boss, they had Taro, who only showed up, I think, thrice at most in the manga. Visually, I'd argue this is one of the best looking ones so far. The sprite work is solid and translates the spirit of Takahashi's original artwork pretty well. You've got a light attack, a heavy attack, jump, and a guard button. Though you can map the jump to be up on the D-pad now too, thankfully. Specials are really awkward to use here, because somehow in an attempt to simplify the controls, they made them significantly worse to use. Every special is performed either by pressing both attack buttons simultaneously or holding down a button and a direction, then letting go just the button but not the direction. The longer you charge, the stronger the special becomes. The issue is that doing this feels extremely inconsistent. It's unclear how long you really have to charge for either variant to come out, and I was personally never able to get a feel for it, because it just ends up feeling like the timing necessary is totally random. Other than your usual arcade and versus modes, this game also has Team Challenge. Both players choose 5 characters, and you proceed to have 5 consecutive matches with your picks, with the winner being whoever gets 3 wins first. Byakuran Aika is the only Ranma game released on Sega CD, and it's yet another visual novel. Pretty much everything I said regarding the PCE one applies here as well, though the story is different. This time, several of Ranma's acquaintances have mysteriously gone missing, and he has to go and find them. The game also has an original character called Arisa, whom basically the entire narrative revolves around. The story itself is actually pretty alright, but the game is just kind of a chore to go through, due in part to its often pretty off-model visuals, and especially because of its combat system. You guessed it, this game has the exact same rock-paper-scissors combat as Hiryu Densetsu, and I assure you, it's not gotten any better since then. I'd only really recommend this game to the same people who'd be interested in Toraware no Hanayome, because other than that, it's kind of just alright. For the last Game Boy game, we have easily the weirdest one. Kakugeki Mondou is a trivia adventure game RPG. Never thought I'd be using those words in the same sentence like that, but here we are. Narratively, I don't even know what's going on in this one. You just kind of go around and talk to people. There's 3 kinds of NPCs. The first is your traditional flavor text character, the second will ask you random trivia regarding the anime and manga, and the third makes you fight them. Fights in this game are pretty weird, because instead of being turn-based, you select 9 moves at the start of the battle and watch them play out in turns with your enemy. A fight ends when either someone dies or when everyone runs out of moves, at which point the character with more remaining health wins. There's a versus mode where you can play this with other players, though I'm really not sure why you would want to ever do that. Winning at either the fights or the trivia levels Ranma up, which in turn lets you go to more places and do more of the same. Didn't finish this one either, I'm gonna be honest. I genuinely have no idea who this is made for. Before we get into the next game proper, I'd just like to go on a little tangent first. See, the last 4 games were all at the very least co-developed by a studio named Rumiko. Finding information on these guys seems completely impossible, but I do have my theories, though mind this is all completely speculative and could be totally wrong. I believe that this might have been a company at the very least directly endorsed by Rumiko Takahashi herself. They've only ever made Ranma games, and Takahashi has used the word Rumik in her project several times before, but I have absolutely no evidence to support this claim, so I'll leave it at that. The first of these games this company made was Akaneko-dan teki Hihou. This game is a traditional turn-based RPG, so I think it's a good idea to start with the story. Like many of the other games, this one doesn't adapt anything, but rather just makes up an original storyline. It starts with the Juzenkyo guide being a dumbass and accidentally freeing the ghost cat king from his grave, before going to get shit-faced. After that, we cut to the Tender home, where Akane and Ranma do some sparring, until Genma gets kidnapped by a bunch of cat people, so the gang goes to rescue him. The plot really isn't all that special, but it captures the tone of the series pretty well, all things considered. This game actually has not 1 but 2 fan translations, one based on the anime and one based on the manga. I played the manga one for obvious reasons, so I can't really tell you what changes the other version has, but it's nice to have the option. Gameplay wise, this is as basic as it gets. If you've played Final Fantasy 1, then just think that, but with the magic system removed, and we basically get the idea. Everyone has a regular attack and a key gauge that they can fill up to use a special attack. Every character falls into a traditional RPG archetype, with some having either just 1 or no offensive skills at all. By using a kettle or a bucket, which are key items you get pretty much instantly, you can swap between everyone's regular and cursed states. This changes both their stats and their available skills, and you'd think that this would be a great avenue for strategy, but unfortunately this game is insultingly easy. It's also pretty short, taking only about 10 to 15 hours. It's definitely something fans will get a lot out of, but if you're just looking for a good SNES RPG, then you're better off playing something like Bahamut Lagoon or Rudra no Hihou instead. Chōgi Rambuhen is without a doubt the best Ranma game ever made. It's also broken in the most fun way imaginable. I'd put it in the same tier of fighting games as that SNES Sailor Moon game, Bloody Roar 3 or KOF 97. Extremely fun, not in spite of its brokenness, but due in part because of it, while at the same time still being a very competently made fighting game in its own right. Visually, the game is similar to Hard Battle, albeit a lot more refined, and it was originally going to be localized as a sequel to it, which is something the fan translation, which is what you're seeing right now, carried over. It took them way too many attempts, but this game is a traditional 4-button fighter, similar to something like most SNK fighters. Everyone gets either 1 or multiple command moves that they can use by either pressing both lights or heavies simultaneously, or by pressing a button in a direction. There's also a bunch of specials with command inputs. This is also the first and only one of these games with supers. To use them you have to taunt and let the animation play out until your health bar starts flashing. Only while in this state can you actually use your super. If the taunt gets interrupted by anything, or you get hit after, you instantly lose the super. Because of this, it's honestly really impractical to use, and most of the time it just doesn't do nearly enough damage to justify leaving yourself vulnerable during the taunt. The fundamentals in this game are super solid. Funnily enough, where it has the most issues is in its stages, which isn't to say that they're bad, but not a single one of them has anything to do with the manga, instead taking you around the world anywhere from Antarctica to Taj Mahal, which isn't really a flaw, just funny. There's even a tag team mode for anybody who likes that kind of thing. Unfortunately, the game does have one big issue. The frame rate is rough to say the least. The game never reaches the intended 60 FPS and often dips to below 30. But thankfully there's a fan patch that makes the game run smooth as butter, and is generally just really fun. This game's even on Fightcade, and against all odds I ended up finding a bunch of matches. So you know what, just for the hell of it, I ended up making a quick tier list for this game, and I'm gonna be listing every character from worst to best and quickly justify their placement, because I really do think that this game has quite a lot of potential, obviously being great for fans, but also just as a standalone fighting game. At the very bottom is Genma. His normals suck, his command moves are borderline useless, and his only specials are a DP and a charge whose strong version does go full screen, but can be countered super easily. His super is his best tool, but it has all of the same weaknesses as the charge, and you're rarely ever going to be able to use it. Hinako has basically no tools of note except for her commands, which are great mix-up tools. But instead of a taunt, she gets an install into her adult form, which makes her a way better character, but its use is limited, and how much you can do in it is pretty much random. Kodachi has some very good neutrals, including one that's both a backdash and an attack, but the rest of her kit is very situational. Despite being the boss character, Herb's kit is so rounded that he doesn't really excel at much. His dive kick command is really good, but has a very slow startup. Musei would be pretty bad, but he's got the best dive kick in the game and really good tools to close in on you. Ranma has Bison's scissor kick, the best DP in the game, and a really strong dive kick. Ukyo is the only real zoner in the game and can stun you, so while not all that good on the whole, she can deal with most of the bullshit in the game pretty well. Akane is a pressure beast, with a million ways to keep it up as well as a solid air grab. Ryoga has a crazy strong mix-up game and can come at you from any direction, with most of his attacks easily chaining into each other. Shampoo gets a double jump, dive kick, great mix-up tools, an air grab, and a Tatsumaki equivalent for good measure, all of which comes together for crazy pressure potential. Ranko has everything Ranma has, as well as a better command, a double jump, and generally higher speed, which gives her insane rushdown potential. Her only drawback is being a charge character. Kuno is basically this game's Shoto, except that one of his commands is a really quick backdash that also attacks forwards, and his anti-air goes back down, which is just insane. And then to top it all off, we have Mariko. This character is pure evil. Her command is a free cross-up, her projectiles go full screen and are air okay, and her normals are really good, including a free slide. As if all of that wasn't enough, a lot of her moves are also plus on block, dealing a shit ton of chip damage, so even if she can't break you up, she can still pressure you to death. Oh, and most importantly, her super is called the Unibomber. If you're a fan of older fighting games, then I very highly recommend giving this one a chance. It's really fun. Because we needed at least one more rock paper scissors game to cap it off, we have Ougi Jaanken. Have you ever thought to yourself, man, I sure do love columns, I wish there was an RPS variant of it that fucking sucked? No? Me neither, because I don't think anybody actually likes columns. And also because that's fucking stupid. You just drop a bunch of blocks of the same type on top of each other, then drop the block that beats it on top to break the entire row. The longer your chain, the more trash you send to your opponent. Because this game works off the same versus system as Puyo Puyo. Whoever tops out first loses. I really don't know why anybody would play this, because it's just not as fun as Puyo or even traditional columns. And I'd argue columns isn't even fun to begin with. And the last game on our list is Battle Renaissance. This is also a fighting game, though instead of taking after Street Fighter, this one takes after Tekken, with each button corresponding to a different limb. Everyone also gets a solid section of specials. Too bad, the issue is that this game's input interpreter is fucking dog shit. I swear I've had more trouble inputting specials in this game than any of the other fighters. It just won't work sometimes. I even looked at other playthroughs online and I can safely say I'm not the only one with this problem. Doing anything just feels horribly sluggish, and it's like there's this weird input delay to everything. Other than playing like absolute shit, the big standout thing about this game is that it's the only Ranma fighting game that actually uses the transformation gimmick. Every now and then it'll start raining on one of the two edges of the screen. If it says squall, the water's cold, and if it says geyser, it's hot. Touch it and you transform. You can tell you transform because the game loads in a completely different character and tries to mask it with a ball of light. Transforming into a character's cursed state is pretty much the worst thing that could happen to you, as it always puts you at a disadvantage, either by making you take more damage and deal less, or by just flat out taking away all of your moves. What makes it worse is that pretty much half the roster is completely unaffected by this mechanic, giving them an unfair advantage by default. If you get transformed as Ryoga, for instance, your only real hope to make anything work until you can turn back is spam his single attack that does virtually no damage and crosses the enemy up and pray. There's also Haposai, who is insufferable to fight against because he's so tiny that half the moves in the game just don't hit him. To give credit where it's due though, the way the game handles its story mode is pretty interesting. You're plopped on an island world map and barring the first and final fights, are free to fight any enemy in whatever order you like as long as you can travel there. Each fight has has unique pre and post cutscenes and give you an explanation for the fights, and it's actually pretty neat to see. The game also once again has some really unique character choices, with Ryu and Rouge making their only appearance in anything outside of the manga. Now, allegedly this game was going to get localized somewhere down the line, and the voice actors for these characters were already chosen, with Matt Smith being set to voice Ryu. Do with this information what you will. Now, technically, that's all, but there's one more thing I want to talk about. See, while researching the MSX version of Hiryu Densetsu, I accidentally stumbled upon something a bit strange. So there's this series of bootleg MSX versions of Tetris with backgrounds and artwork from both Ranma and Takahashi's prior series Urusei Yatsura. Other than the visuals, it's really just regular old Tetris, but a part of me rejoices in the fact that someone out there felt the need to make and sell this. And that's every non-pachinko video game based on Ranma half. Usually when it comes to licensed games, especially back then, it was rare to find a good one, let alone one worth talking about. Sure, you had stuff like X-Men Children of the Atom, but for every one of that, you also got Friday the 13th on NES. But, somehow even at its worst, Ranma has at the very least had some interesting things to talk about every time, which I really didn't expect. Maybe I'll eventually take a look at games based on other Takahashi series like Inuyasha or Urusei Yatsura, since I know those had a bunch, but for now, I think I'm good on all that. With that said, I wish you all a wonderful morning, day, evening, or night. Cheers. I'm gonna go find me some Ming Dynasty pussy.